With the collapse of the great polar warp gates, chaos swept across the world. Everywhere civilizations burned and madness overtook order. Ulthuan suffered greater than any other land, for many amongst the demonic host thirsted for elven souls above all others. Had great heroes not arisen to meet the challenge, the elves would have been utterly destroyed, and their land made over into a court of pandemonium. Greatest of these heroes was Astarielle the Defender, first of the Phoenix Kings. It was he who rallied the elves to hold back the demonic tide, and his example ever spurred others to greater deeds. In time, Anarion took Ever-Queen Astarielle as his wife, and she bore him 2 fine children, Morelion and Yvraine. As the Phoenix King fought to preserve Ulthuan, the Ever-Queen withdrew into the hallowed woods of Avalon to raise their children as far from war as those days would allow. Avalon had so far been spared the horrors of the invasion, for the demons sensed that Durthu and his kind were not dissimilar in nature to themselves, and were wary of attacking their domain if easier prey was close at hand. Such a state of affairs could not last, however. One fateful day, when Anarion's army was campaigning far from Avalon, a demonic host, greater than any yet seen, descended upon Avalon and the slaughter began. As Avalon burned, Durthu and his kind fought alongside the elves. They could have fled back to the great forest, but chose to stand with their allies. Many were destroyed, others were driven mad with despair, and yet still the spirits of the forest battled on. But Avalon could neither be saved by valor nor by strength of arms. Hour by hour, the elves and spirits were driven deeper into their heartlands until finally there was nowhere left to retreat. It was late on that last day that Astarielle came to Durthu with a desperate request, that he rescue her children from the coming doom. For a time, Durthu stood silent as the forest burned around them, the tears and pleas of his petitioner seemingly unheeded. To carry blooded creatures along the Oak of Ages world routes would no doubt be seen as a dire transgression, and he was minded not to invoke the wrath of his peers. Yet in this time in Avalon, Durthu had seen how the elves and the forest spirits had been far stronger and wiser together than they had been apart. If either survived the darkness, that strength would surely serve the great forest well in whatever world followed. So it was that when Durthu spoke again, he agreed to Astarielle's request, but, he cautioned, there would be a price to pay. If he saved the Ever-Queen's offspring, the great forest would one day claim many elves as its own, so that they might serve to protect it, as they had tended the land of Avalon. Now it was Astarielle's turn to fall silent, for there was something ominous in Durthu's tone. Yet she had little choice. If Yvraine died, the line of the Ever-Queen would die with her, and the elves would soon after fade forever. It was then that a colossal demon broke through the elven lines, bellowing in triumph as it swept aside the last of the Ever-Queen's bodyguard with its 4 mighty arms. Even in a day beset with horrors, this was a cruel fate. No mere foot soldier of the demon host was this, but the mighty Nakari, foremost servant of thirsting Slanesh. He was not merely a despoiler of bodies, but a devourer of spirits. His cruel embrace brought not death, but the oblivion of the soul. Kissing her children one last time, the Ever-Queen now gave them hurriedly to Durthu's keeping. As the spirit led Morelion and Yvraine away, Astarielle summoned what little of her magic remained unspent, and went calmly on, into the battle to meet her destiny. Astarielle was slain in this attack, and her children could not be found amongst the carnage. Her fate was so dreadful that the elves to this day refuse to speak of it, and when Anarion learned of it, it drove him to taking up the cursed Sword of Cain, along with the deaths of his children, as he saw. When Durthu returned to the great forest, he was dismayed that his home had fared little better than Avalon. The great greenwood that once sprawled across the world was now but a fraction of its former size. The land where it had flourished bore the scars of fire and wild magic that had driven it back, and even then, its borders were assailed by demons beyond counting. It seemed that he had exchanged one hopeless battle for another, yet appearances were deceptive. As the great forest's battle for survival had become more desperate, the natures of some of its spirits, particularly those of the striplings, had changed. Many were now wilder and more aggressive, perhaps even cruel, and their lithe and slender forms had grown much more suited to battle. It also transpired that much of the forest that had been destroyed in Durthu's absence had been lost many years ago. The outpost that remained, nestled between the shoulders of two great mountain ranges, had held its ground for more than a decade, and was even now spreading outwards once more. Yet, even if Durthu had been wrong about the forest's plight, he had been correct about his fellow elders' reception. Durthu, wisest of the Tree Lords, was readily displeased that the sanctity of the wood roots had been breached. Astarielle, who had for long centuries directed the great forest's wrath against its despoilers, was consumed with bitter fury and demanded that the interlopers be slain. At first, Durthu agreed with Astarielle, but eventually relented. Eldest he was and fearful of change, but so too did he fear that the forest's survival might have come by only sacrificing the peaceful side of their nature. Unchecked, the spirits of the great forest would become an enemy as dire as that which they had fought, and Durthu's bargain presented some small hope that such a destiny could be prevented. Though Astarielle railed angrily against the decision, Durthu agreed that Astarielle's heirs would remain within the great forest until their homeland was safe once more, provided that they never awakened from within their magical sleep whilst in its bounds. Thus did Morelion and Yvraine slumber through the last terrible deeds of that war. Avalon was cleansed, and in time would become beautiful once more, but it would never recapture the glory of its ancient splendor. The spirits of the great forest fought on as best they could, knowing that they could not end the onslaught, but only endure it. Meanwhile, Anarion was driven to madness by the loss of his wife and children. Soon after, he fell into darkness and could only redeem himself upon his death. In the end, the world was saved not by force of arms, but by the cunning of an elf mage, whose great ritual of banishment cast the demons from the world. With the passing of the demons, Durthu was finally able to keep the promise that he had made to Astarielle. He brought Morelion and Yvraine to Ulthuan's beautiful Gaean Vale, and there left them to be discovered. Neither sibling ever recalled anything of leaving Ulthuan, only that Oakheart had rescued them on the night of their mother's sacrifice. Yvraine soon became the next Everqueen, and Morelion a stalwart protector ever at her side. As for Durthu, he longed to rebuild the glory of Avalon, but knew that the great forest needed his guidance far more. Gathering to him almost all of the spirits that survived the invasion of Ulthuan, he returned home. Many centuries passed, and little by little, the spirits of the great forest and the lessons that they had taught passed from the tales of the elves, remaining only in half-remembered tradition and folk tales. In time, Ulthuan grew in power and glory, establishing many colonies overseas. The world was riven by earthquakes, and the world roots were severed, isolating the great forest from the wider world. Through it all, the elders watched with patient eyes, awaiting the opportunity to collect on Astarielle's debt. Far away, an age of tragedy was dawning. Malekith, son of Anarion by his second wife, sought to claim the Phoenix throne by force, and in so doing split the elven race forever. No longer was there one race of elves. Now there were the Dark Elves, loyal to the traitor Malekith, and the High Elves, who were true to the Phoenix throne. Ulthuan was torn apart in the battles that followed, and by the time Malekith led his defeated followers to the chill land of Naggaroth, the shattered nation was but a shadow of its former self. Never again would the High Elves know peace. In the rare occasions that they were not locked in vendetta with their hated cousins, their colossal arrogance sparked conflict elsewhere, chiefly with the dwarfs of the mountains. Many colonies were drawn into these fruitless campaigns, but the elves of Athel-Loren refused to become involved. When Phoenix King Caradriel finally gave the order that all loyal folk of Ulthuan should abandon their colonies and return home, only the elves of Athel-Loren refused, as they soon declared their independence from the Phoenix throne. As the High Elves withdrew westward, the dwarfs advanced. As the first snows of winter began to fall, the vengeful children of the mountains descended upon Athel-Loren, hacking and burning. This callous action drove the forest into a fury, but its spirits had ever been sluggish during the months of frost. The dryads were soon scattered or slain, and Durthu, the only ancient not yet at slumber, was wounded near to death by keen dwarven axes. Realizing that the forest could not defeat the dwarfs alone, Durthu bade it draw back from the encroachers and open up pathways that thrust them into the fringes of the elven settlements. Thinking themselves under attack, the elves assailed the dwarves, filling the air with volley after volley of arrows. As the forest had twisted the advance of the dwarves, so did it now guide the footsteps of the elves. Whenever the dwarves turned to face this threat, the elves slipped away into the trees, only to emerge impossible distances away moments later. Unable to defeat a foe upon which they could never lay honest steel, the remaining dwarves retreated. In the wake of victory, the elves began to dwell within the borders of Athel-Loren, for they feared reprisals from the dwarves more than they did the capricious will of the forest. The forest did not resist, and the elves wondered why. The wayward children of Ulthuan never heard the harsh words that raged between Adanhu and Cyrodiil as they argued over their fate. Durthu, instigator of the current situation, remained silent through it all. He had suffered greatly from the dwarven axes. His once kind nature had all but fallen away, and he was no longer fully trusted to his own judgment. Ultimately, Adanhu's will prevailed, and the forest now opened up many of its secrets to the elves, though the dryads and treemen took care never to intentionally reveal themselves. At the very heart of Athel-Loren, Ariel, foremost amongst the elven magi, spoke with the forest for the first time, and before long, many elves learned of this art of tree singing. It was then that the elves, always respectful of all things natural, fully embraced Athel-Loren as their home. More than that, the elves treated the forest with the awe and reverence it deserved and demanded, seeing the essence of their ancestral gods in its seasonal cycles. They vowed never to take from the forest without giving back equally in service and sacrifice. When the elves needed wood to burn in order to survive the icy winters, they would take only fallen branches, and in the spring they would nurture and tend new saplings, encouraging them to shape its graceful halls above and below the ground. When elves hunted the animals of the forest for food and clothing, they used all that they took, and gave thanks to Athel-Loren in ceremonies of blood. Thus was the pact between Durthu and Astarielle finally fulfilled.